Pokemon Scarlet and Violet were the first Pokemon games launching with an open world engine, and just like the transition from 2D to 3D, the move from a more traditional top-down linear game into a fully open world has been quite the bumpy ride for the franchise. Yet despite the poor graphics and occasional glitches, Scarlet and Violet do feel similar to other Pokemon games. You've got a Pokédex to complete, gyms to take on, and some rivals to push you through the story. But apart from these large themes that seem to make Pokemon games, I've noticed that there's a lot of features that were commonplace in the past, which are completely missing from this open world entry. That's not necessarily a bad thing, by the way, as some of them make sense given the open world setting. But most of them were features that gave previous entries a bit more soul and flair. So today I want to go through the 9 Pokemon game features missing from Scarlet and Violet. Let's begin with a classic, the Daycare. In every previous mainline Pokemon game, there would be at least one daycare facility where you could leave your Pokemon for a certain amount of time, giving them the opportunity to gain some levels and maybe spawn in a couple of eggs here and there while you went on your journey. I'm pretty sure that the Daycare was introduced back in Generation 1 as a way to help level up your Abra or Magikarp without having to constantly switch them in and out of battle. However, in newer entries, the main use of the Daycare has been for breeding competitive Pokemon, since it was the best way to get the right natures, high IVs, and pass down egg moves. But as the series has grown over the years, they've introduced other methods to do the same thing, which require much less grinding. We have mints for changing natures, hyper training to boost your IVs, and egg moves can just be learned by simply holding a mirror herb and setting up a picnic. Even leveling up your Pokemon has become rather easy since the EXP share item is no longer an item, but a feature that's constantly active for Pokemon in your party, and we also have raid dens which give you plenty of experience candies and help level up a weaker Pokemon much faster than leaving them in a daycare for a certain amount of time. So as you can see, having a dedicated daycare building has become nearly pointless, a legacy feature one might say. It still could have been included in Scarlet and Violet, but all of its uses and benefits have been outsourced and outperformed by newer mechanics. That being said, I still prefer the daycare method for breeding Pokemon over the current method of just stand there I guess and check the basket occasionally. Personally, I think it's nice to just ride around your bike and wait for the daycare lady to cross her arms. It has some charm to it. It feels a lot less boring than checking my basket every other minute. In fact, the whole picnic basket method has completely put me off from breeding Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet in the first place, which may have been Game Freak's goal all along. If they want players to focus more on themes like friendship and caring for specific Pokemon, they wouldn't want players having to breed 5 boxes full of these same Pokemon, only to then go and release them en masse later. So the lack of daycare centers might be intentional, but we shall see if that's the case in future games. I for one hope they come back, as the Masuda method is my preferred way of shiny hunting, and it has become extremely boring without the dedicated facility for it. Speaking of facilities, the next missing feature is that you cannot enter any buildings. I think that all of us felt very put off when we got to Los Platos and realized that we can no longer go inside people's houses in this open world entry. This probably felt extra jarring since the game starts you out in your own house and then lets us go inside of Nemona's house too, setting up the expectation that yes, you can enter buildings, only to quickly crush it in the game's first town. Now to be fair, Pokemon Sword and Shield also did not let you enter any houses in the first 2 major towns you go to. Turffield is just as locked up as any town in Paldea, but that's not the case for any of the other towns in that game. Even Motostoke at least gave you several shops you could enter, a hotel and a train station. Sure, you didn't have any houses, but you could still go inside like half the places in town. That is not the case in Scarlet and Violet. All the stores do now is display their items on a menu. Restaurants, same deal. Any other building? It's completely closed off to players. In fact, there's only 3 types of buildings you can enter in these games: the gym building, the sandwich shop, and the hair salon. There are a few exceptions like the Treasure Eatery and the Academy, but overall, everyone in this open world game has left their doors locked and shut. Getting to go inside all the houses in previous games made them feel more like a fun RPG than reality, and unlocked the potential to develop the world and its lore. Getting to see the different interior designs and thoughts of the locals was a nice way to give more depth to the world. Whether the lack of this feature was intentional by Game Freak or a side effect of short development time, the fact that we don't get all the extra tidbits about each town from its residents ended up making the game feel a lot more barren and empty, despite the huge open world. Just like with the daycares, it's a feature I personally miss. It added charm to the world and gave us something to explore when we entered a new town. Now you just go there for the gym and then there's nothing else to do. I made a whole video about it. Most of the towns are just empty. There's nothing to do there. Would've been nice if we could go into houses or not, but it is what it is. The Battle Tower. Another major building missing from the world of Scarlet and Violet is an endgame battle mode, which I'll refer to as the Battle Tower for the rest of this video. The concept of battle towers was introduced back in Generation 3 and has appeared in basically every Pokemon game up until Scarlet and Violet. Before you go comment, but what about the Ace Academy tournament? Yes, that is an endgame battle mode, but no, it is not a battle tower. The thing that sets the two apart is that battle towers have a wider variety of enemy teams, a special currency to buy rare items, and strong trainers that require players to build at least a somewhat competitive Pokemon team. And that last part is key, since I think the Battle Tower format is what leads players into the real long-term activity in these games: competitive. As you play through the game normally, you'll just catch whatever Pokemon you think are cool, give them random held items, and then teach them super strong moves. Usually that's enough to get you through the story, but it's not enough to get you hooked on Pokemon battles or keep playing the games in the long term, unless you just want a shiny hunt. But once you reach the end game, there's some sort of battle facility where you realize, oh shoot, the Pokemon I used throughout the story aren't actually all that strong. And then you go learn all about the competitive things like natures, IVs, EVs, and strategies you can use to build a strong team. The Battle Tower is the place that nudges you to further explore the game's mechanics, build powerful Pokemon, and potentially get you into the competitive side of battles. Yes, you can technically just go online and battle strangers in Scarlet and Violet like right now, but the Battle Towers are a lighter, more convenient way to set you on that path, and it's even more important now when you have to pay for Nintendo Switch Online in order to even participate in the PvP option. Unfortunately, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet have completely done away with the Battle Towers and given us the Ace Academy tournament, which is kinda similar to the Champion Cup rematches in Pokemon Sword and Shield, except the pool of trainers is much smaller and the odds of getting one of those cool looking Pokeballs is a tiny bit less. Compared to the other missing features I've discussed so far, I'm a bit 50-50 on this one. On one hand, I do miss the single player incentive to build and try out competitive teams. On the other, I absolutely do not miss the horrible grind that came with the previous Battle Towers. If you wanted to get good held items, TMs, or things like bottle caps, you'd be stuck doing fight after fight for hours just to get enough BP. I really do appreciate the fact that I can just go to one of the shops in Scarlet and Violet and outright purchase the items I need without having to grind. Then again, if I want to build a competitive team, these items get pretty expensive pretty fast, and I have to grind anyways, but it's for money this time instead of BP. And of course, the most efficient method for getting money, before the DLC at least, was to spam Chi-Yu at the Ace Academy tournament. So I'm not too sure if that grinding problem really got resolved here. But I will say that Scarlet and Violet are the first Pokemon games where I haven't bothered to build a competitive team, since I didn't really have an in-game reason to do so. I know some people will build their Pokemon so that they can take on the higher difficulty raids. I personally do not enjoy the raid system in these games, so I have no reason to build Pokemon. Now, if you do have a reason to build Pokemon, you might want to have this feature that's no longer in the games: Pokerus. Part of the Pokemon building grind is getting enough EVs for certain stats. In the newer Pokemon games, the easiest way to do so is by buying a bunch of vitamins and feeding them to your Pokemon. But in older entries where said vitamins were very expensive, the more efficient route was to go battle wild Pokemon and grind EVs naturally. There are items known as the power items that would give Pokemon a specific EV after winning a battle, which are still in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. But there was another way to get double EVs from battle, which made the EV grinding process a lot faster in general: Pokerus. This was a mysterious Pokemon virus that would spread among Pokemon in your party, although a Pokemon would no longer be able to spread it to others after a certain period of time. The timer wouldn't keep going if the Pokemon was in a box, so many players would hold at least one Pokerus Pokemon for later, since getting this thing to spread onto your other Pokemon would make things a lot faster. The only problem was that the odds of getting Pokerus were 1 in 21,000, which means that you had to get super lucky or have a friend who did and is willing to trade fight an infected Pokemon over. There weren't really any downsides to this mechanic other than its verbiage, which made having a virus sound like a good thing? Game Freak probably decided to get rid of it, especially after we all went through that nasty global pandemic. I think this decision was more of a covert PR move than anything else. At the same time, unlike all the other features missing so far, I don't particularly miss this one. Mainly because I don't like having the anxiety of forgetting all of my active Pokerus mons in my party and then losing the ability to spread it around. Sure, the extra EV gain boost was nice, but considering how cheap the vitamins have gotten in the recent games, I think that more than makes up for the lack of Pokerus in Scarlet and Violet. However, something they have not made up for is the next thing on this list: random encounters. For the majority of this franchise's history, Pokemon were found through random encounters. You'd be walking down a path, in a cave, or surfing on water, and bam, interrupted by a wild Pokemon. This encounter method was pretty common for RPGs back when Pokemon first came out, in the 90s, but a lot has changed since then. In Scarlet and Violet, Pokemon will spawn outside of towns, and you can walk into them or throw a ball to enter battles. Some Pokemon are skittish and will run away from you, others are aggressive and will run into you, but most of them will just be chilling out, giving you the option to battle if you wanted to do so. There are a few Pokemon that have some extra mechanics for their encounters, like Wuglet hiding in its little rock when it spots you, with certain Pokemon having to get knocked out of a tree, but in general, there's not very much variety when it comes to special encounters. That being said, there are two ways Pokemon spawn in these games. You have fixed spawns and random spawns. As the name suggests, fixed spawns implies that this specific Pokemon will always spawn at that specific location. You may remember the Terrasto Scyther near Cortando or the Terrasovian in the flower fields up north, but there's loads of normal Pokemon that have fixed spawns too. For example, when you start off your game, there will always be a Psyduck hanging out by the bridge near the lab. There will always be a Chansey near the pond south of Cortando to help you get some extra EXP before taking on the gyms. Once you've defeated these Pokemon, they will respawn again the following day, meaning you will not be encountering them as often as the random spawns. Speaking of which, these are Pokemon which will spawn in the world from a pool of possible Pokemon. The spawns are determined by the time of day, type of ground, and their rarity. A good example of this is Eevee, which can spawn in the olive fields west of Cortando, but only 10% of the time. That means that even though the encounter will not be random, there's no guarantee you'll find an Eevee when you go into the area. So even though the encounter is not random, the spawned Pokemon are. There is still an element of randomness. The nice thing about this format is that you can significantly improve the odds of finding certain rare Pokemon by making a sandwich or eating food that boosts the encounter rate for that specific type of Pokemon. The most common one you might know about is making a normal encounter sandwich and going to the flower fields up north, which make a ton of Chansey spawn in, giving you a great way to quickly level up your Pokemon. Without the sandwich, you'll barely see any Chansey in that area, as their natural spawn rate is only 1%. So the good thing about this setup is that it allows for Pokemon to appear as rare, while also giving players a method to significantly reduce the grind needed to find them. The lack of random encounters is another feature that I'm a little split on. On one hand, finding rare Pokemon is no longer an extremely painful grind. This is not something I had realized was a problem until I went back to Sword and Shield for a character run and had to spend almost an hour doing random encounters just to find one Pharaoh Seed. Random encounters are also an effective way to slow down your progress and make a small area seem a lot bigger, which works well for older games with small closed routes. And even then, this feature tended to feel annoying and intrusive, like when you're trying to shiny hunt with a Pokeradar in Generation 4. In fact, every previous Pokemon game had a repel item, which is also gone from these games, that would allow you to block random encounters from happening, giving you the opportunity to freely explore an area for a short period of time. In terms of quality of life, I do think that Scarlet and Violet are better off without these random encounters. However, I also don't think that the game handled the overworld spawns too well either. Wild Pokemon just wander around aimlessly, others I struggle to start a battle with, and rare Pokemon don't feel all that special anymore. Many of these routes feel very short and bland since we aren't constantly slowed down by random Pokemon popping out of nowhere. Or when they do, it's kind of frustrating. There's nothing that makes them feel unique. Going into a cave just doesn't feel the same when I'm not harassed by Zubat and Geodude every 5 steps, but is that really a bad thing? I don't think so. What I do think is that the way we encounter wild Pokemon is the biggest design challenge that Game Freak has to face when moving into the open world. Simply having hordes of Pokemon spawn and walk around isn't enough to create a unique experience or feel for certain areas. But how can they do that without the constant annoyance of random encounters? I, for one, have no ideas. I'm not a game designer, I'm a YouTuber. But if you have any ideas, do drop them in the comments down below, since I am very curious to see what people think about this topic specifically. What do you think is the best way to handle Pokemon encounters in an open world game? And while you do that, let's move on to the next missing feature: required trainer battles. Just as encountering wild Pokemon has become an optional feature, so have trainer battles. In older games, if you walked within the line of sight of a trainer, they would notice you and challenge you to a fight. Just like random encounters, this was a good mechanic to make areas feel larger or get players to walk a certain direction. Of course, not every trainer was stagnant, staring into the void like a Sudowoodo waiting to pounce on the next sucker to walk in their line of sight. Many would walk around or turn to look in other directions, giving players the option to skip certain battles. This was extra apparent in Pokemon Sword and Shield, where each route had 1, maybe 2 required trainer battles, giving the player the ability to sneak around everyone else. But in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, they got rid of that function entirely. If you want to battle a trainer in these games, you have to walk up to them and then interact to start the battle. Without any trainers to block paths or stop you in your tracks, exploration became very simple in this open world game. But just as with the other missing features, it also made it feel more empty. There are no roadblocks, so you can just go full speed ahead to the next town or area, and completely ignore all of the NPCs, which begs the question, what's the point of trainer battles anyways? Well, they give your Pokemon extra experience, their dialogue can give more context to the world, its lore or hidden items nearby, and most importantly, they can show off Pokemon you don't already have. As an example, the only required trainer battle in Sword and Shield's Route 3 is a schoolboy which has a Sizzlipede on his team. Sizzlipede is a Pokemon that spawns on Route 3, but it is a 1% encounter Pokemon. So after getting to battle him, some players might open up their Pokédex to check where this thing can be caught and see that it's on the same route that they're on right now. This would in theory encourage them to stay a bit longer and look for said Pokemon. Now I know that this won't apply to all people playing the game, but it is a nice to have design element that gives the game a bit more charm. Unfortunately, since you can skip every trainer in Paldea, most of them don't have such rare Pokemon. There's a few Pokemaniacs that have the baby pseudo legendary dragons and hint towards checking the decks so you can see where they spawn, but you have to completely go out of your way to find these trainers in the first place and they don't look very approachable. The only real way these games encourage you to battle its trainers is with the league reps promising some rewards if you defeat some of the trainers on this route, not all. But apart from this very extrinsic reward, there's no reason to go out of your way in battle. In general, I do appreciate the extra level of player choice given to us by the lack of required trainer battles. However, I think it ends up being a net negative since the existence of these trainers doesn't contribute to the world's feel. Why are these people here? Why do they have these Pokemon? Of course there's a few trainers here and there that meet this bare minimum, but overall they didn't bring much to the table. I think that this is another game design issue that Game Freak needs to resolve in future titles. I'm all for trainers being optional as long as they provide some value to the player if you choose to battle them. Maybe they give us more lore or stories or show off rare Pokemon that you may have missed. Perhaps some of them can give you a rare item or show off strategies that the player might not know about. I think about the Eviolite trainer in Sword and Shield. There is a lot that can be done here. I just hope they actually do something in the future games. And they can learn a lot from their previous entries. You could also learn a lot from this next missing feature, the move tutors. NPCs in older Pokemon games would occasionally do something really unique and cool. They could teach your Pokemon a special move that couldn't be learned anywhere else. It kinda felt like a reward for exploring the world and finding the secluded guru who has mastered some secret skill, and now you get to use it too since you went out of your way to find them. There were typically multiple different NPCs that gave you access to several different types of moves. You had someone to give you a special move for the starter Pokemon, an NPC to teach your Dragon's Draco Meteor, and others who would teach moves in exchange for money, shards, or BP. This was a mechanic that added a bit more life to the in-game world, but at the same time, they progressively got more and more gimmicky and grindy. It got to the point where if I wanted a certain special move, I'd have to spend hours at the battle tower, the mines, or surfing on a mantine. While there was a potential for these NPCs, since most of them ended up being just glorified endgame TM shops, I'm kinda glad that they're gone in this generation. However, I do think that this was the one game where they could have made good use of move tutors, since a lot of the plot centers around having a giant school. If there's gonna be tutors, it's gonna be at the school, right? Either way, this is one mechanic I definitely do not miss, especially with how it was handled in the more recent titles. Goodbye and good riddance for now. Fishing. While older Pokemon games had mostly random encounters for their wild Pokemon, they also had a very specific way to let players seek out an encounter instead. Headbutt, the fishing rod. Some games had one rod, others had different types of rods, which would help you encounter stronger and stronger Pokemon. And the way it worked was simple. You see water, you can fish in it. Some of the more recent titles made it so that you can't just fish anywhere, but you did have specific fishing spots on most routes and even in some towns. But in Scarlet and Violet, there is no fishing rod, there are no fishing spots, fish just throw themselves on the beach or swim at you in the water. In terms of pros for having this mechanic, it was a nice way to have an extra encounter method for certain Pokemon, which goes back to the whole how we encounter Pokemon in the game thing. Fishing just added more variety in previous games. It also added a method for shiny hunting certain Pokemon by chain fishing them in games like X and Y. Games that had more than one rod would often encourage you to explore the world and seek out the better rod. Basically, fishing is like sprinkles. It's not necessary for the donut, but it makes it feel a lot more special. The cons of fishing? Well, you'd usually just be reeling in Magikarp 90% of the time, so it probably wasn't a mechanic that players used often. Also, you'd have to backtrack to certain fishing locations when you got a new rod, just to find a rare Pokemon you might have missed in the past. They did this in Sword and Shield as well, where you could get a Feebas from the island lake near Magnolia's house, which is completely out of the way from where the story is trying to take you. So I suspect that many players just didn't bother, which might be why the feature got sunset in these games. That being said, I do find it strange that there is no fishing in Scarlet and Violet, and in fact, this is what inspired me to make this whole video in the first place. I realized that letting players just throw a line in any body of water might seem a bit odd, but it didn't have to be any different than Sword and Shield. The developers definitely could have just added designated fishing pools, but either didn't have the time to, or just didn't fit well enough with the game's overall direction and art style. Maybe they thought the kids these days aren't patient enough to use this mechanic. I'm not too sure, but I do miss having the option. But alas, just like my last romantic relationship, it's gone. But hey, at least there's plenty of fish in the sea. Set mode. Pokemon games have felt easy enough as is, but they just keep making them easier and easier and removing even more options for players to add any sort of difficulty for themselves. First, we lost the EXP share, now we've lost set mode. Unlike the EXP share, which was an item you got to pick up halfway through the game, this was an optional toggle in the settings menu that was defaulted to switch mode, and players had to manually activate it. All it does is remove the dialogue option in battles that tells you what Pokemon your opponent will send out next and gives you the option to switch out your Pokemon. This feature was mainly used by seasoned Pokemon players who wanted a bit more difficulty, speedrunners who wanted to reduce the time spent during battles, and players doing some sort of challenge run, be it Nuzlocke or character runs. It was one of those nice to have features for experienced players, and unlike every other thing missing so far, I have no idea why they decided to get rid of it. Getting rid of the EXP share made the games less grindy, but this just makes you push buttons more frequently and removes the only sort of difficulty toggle players had for the game. It's a bit sad because it kinda communicates that the game designers may see difficulty as bad, yet what most of us remember from older Pokemon games are the difficult battles. You know, Whitney and her Miltank, Red on top of Mount Silver, Cynthia! Some challenge is not a bad thing, and neither was set mode. Please bring it back in future games. Anyways, none of these features are particularly crucial to make the game play well, but they were all features that gave a bit more life and variety to the world. While it makes sense for some of them to be missing due to better alternatives, I suspect that the absence of others contributed to why so many people felt discontent with Scarlet and Violet. I just hope that this was due to rushed production time and not intentional developer choice, because if it is, all Game Freak will achieve in future titles is a very empty open world. And I don't think that's what any of us want. But that's what I think anyways. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on this topic. Do you miss any of these features, and were there any features I missed to cover in this video? Let me know in the comments down below. If you like this type of content, be sure to check out my other analytic videos on these games from the playlist linked on the screen, and subscribe if you've enjoyed. Either way, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!